What do sugar, alcohol, caffeine, and lifting weights all have in common? Well, they could be the secret to your longevity. To break down this science, we've brought in world-renowned neuroscientist and athletic performance specialist, Dr. Tommy Wood. In this episode, we break down what constitutes good nutrition research, we break down the biggest nutrition myths that you see online, we discuss exactly what to eat to keep your brain optimally healthy, and we discuss what the best diet is for humans to eat. This is an amazing episode, so let's get to it. All right, we are live for another episode of Performance That Matters. Very special guest that I've been looking forward to talking to for a very long time, all the way from Seattle, Washington, Dr. Tommy Wood. Tommy, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Tommy, when I read your background, I read your CV and went over it, and I was trying to think of a word to describe what your CV would be like. I came up with the words eclectic, expansive, and exceptionally broad. What word would you use to describe your CV?
Yeah, I think eclectic is the right word, and I've even used that when I submit my CV like for promotion internally at the university, because I just did that last summer, and I even like acknowledge this up front because it's going to be read by like some super dry academics who look at it like, what is this guy doing? So I have to kind of acknowledge that up front, but luckily it also means that I get to do a bunch of super interesting stuff that I enjoy doing. So I think that's a bit of a bonus.
Okay, so first question I have, Tommy. I just want to read this out first before I ask you this. Tommy has an undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Cambridge, a medical degree from the University of Oxford, a Ph.D. in physiology and neuroscience from the University of Oslo. He's a published academic author, lecturer, and a hands-on practitioner working with Olympians and world champions. My question to you, Tommy, are you Benjamin Button? Have you somehow figured out how to turn time back and get all this done, or what's going on here?
That's a good question. For a long period of time, I had like these two parallel tracks that you could almost hear when you read that out, right? One is the like super formal, all the qualifications, neuroscience professor, I run a neuroscience lab, all that kind of stuff. And then the other side was like the applied sports side. So I was a rower at university, a rowing coach at university. I got more and more interested in that side as well. And so like on the side, I had like blogs and podcasts and helped build a company that worked with athletes. And now I work with Formula One drivers primarily through a company called Hinsa Performance. And slowly over time, I've managed to kind of wrestle those two lanes together, because you might think, oh, those sound a bit disconnected. But I think in my head, they all kind of work together. And I'm lucky that the lab that I have at the university is staffed with like 4 brilliant research scientists and a ton of students. So they do all the hard work while I run around on podcasts and hanging out with Formula One drivers and taking all the glory. So that's how I've managed to do all of that.
Was there a crossover point, Tommy, where there was, say, you went and did all your formal education, you had the interest in sports and everything, and then you thought, hey, this can intersect, this can come out, and I can merge these two worlds? Was there a specific point where that happened, or was it always side by side with each other?
Yes. So the first time I started to kind of do some quote unquote work in the sort of the performance side was during my PhD. So like during the day, I'm doing rat stuff, like formal neuroscience stuff. But then the rest of the time, I'm in a chair, I have access to PubMed, I have free time, I'm in Norway. And so then I started to like read more and do more stuff, and then start to kind of build out ideas based on the applied kind of experience that I'd had previously as an athlete and a coach. And then that kind of built out from there, companies and consulting. But it was always kind of parallel to the academic stuff. And people would know me as one or the other, and not both. And then it was actually something that my wife kind of encouraged me around. She's also an academic, and she was like, you know what? If you're an academic, you can kind of just like do whatever you want and get away with it and make it sound kind of fancy. So over time, then I kind of built out the formal part of my research to incorporate some of these other aspects of brain performance, sports performance, and it was kind of then it makes sense to me, because in the lab we study brain injury, neonatal brain injury, traumatic brain injury, concussions. We start to look at, dementia risk factors and that kind of stuff. And that parallels with, making, how do you make your brain perform as well as possible throughout the lifespan? So I kind of like over time built all these bits, and then you're like, oh yeah, we get one brain, we want it to do all this stuff, and what happens to it early in life or in the middle of life or what we try and do with it affects what happens to it later in life. So you can kind of build this big picture where it all sort of slots together. But that took like 10 years for me to figure out how to kind of make sense of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tommy, for this podcast, I want to break it up into two areas you're very, very, very exceptional at. Part one, go over nutrition and health in general and kind of go over some big, broad, sweeping nutrition topics. And then in part two, really narrow down on that brain health and go through. But first and foremost, a topic that I'm very interested in, I know a lot of listeners will be as well, is nutrition research and how it's actually done. There's lots of talk, especially on social media. Everyone will just be quoting papers left, right, and center and going, you know what, in this abstract, it says this and this. And then there's wars that are raged over nutrition research, especially on social media. Can you explain to us, how is this done? What's the process of doing, I guess we'll caveat it with, good nutrition research?
I think one of the main reasons why you these sort of factions and wars online, or maybe there's two reasons / three reasons. The first is that everybody eats, and therefore because they eat, they think they should have an opinion about how food affects health, right? Everything else is a little bit, exercise, sleep. You kind of feel like you require a bit more background knowledge before you're going to start telling people about it. But food is this deeply personal thing that everybody feels they should have an opinion about, rightly or wrongly. If you want an opinion, of course, like, don't let me stop you. The second part is that it's really, really hard to do good nutrition research. Exceptionally difficult. And I can't even promise that I have the right answers to a lot of this stuff for that reason. So there are two broad ways that you could look at research, and this is the case for most sort of lifestyle related and health related research. One is epidemiology, right? So you ask a ton of people how they eat, and then you look at their long-term health outcomes, or you look at their current health status, do some blood tests, do some cognitive function tests, something like that. There's a big sort of crisis in that, or there has been this looming crisis in epidemiological nutrition research, because when you ask people what they eat, they lie, and not on purpose. They just forget. Like, did I have a chocolate bar yesterday? Like, how many apples did I have? And then it sort of like expands out from there. So depending on how the research is done, so like there's this big study in the US. It happens every year in sort of these 2-year waves called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES. In NHANES, when they ask people about what they eat, they call you up and they say, hey, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? And you kind of like have to remember. And then they say, how typical is this for you? And you tell them how typical it was. And then they're like, they ask you about things that people usually forget. Like, when you say you had a beer, do you mean 7 beers? Or like when you say you didn't have dessert, are you sure you didn't have dessert? And then from there, they do that a couple of times, like a weekday and a weekend. And from there, they say how you ate on those 2 days is going to tell you whether you get dementia in 30 years' time. Right. And so if anybody's watching a video version of this, you'll see like Geordie's eyes just went, what? And so like, this is how most nutrition research is done. There's other versions, like a whole host of studies run out of Harvard, like the health professional follow-up study, or the nurses health study, and their questionnaire was slightly different. There's a food frequency questionnaire, and you get this questionnaire, and it says, how many times in the past year did you eat this? And it's things like 1 tablespoon of cream. I have literally no idea how many tablespoons of cream I ate in the last year, right? I don't think anybody does. And so when you then look at these data, and somebody did do this specifically for NHANES, they said that about 60% of all the data in NHANES are not physiologically plausible, like in relation to the person who gave those responses, basically saying that people massively underestimate what they're eating. So, and it's so little that based on, height and weight and all that kind of stuff, like this person cannot be eating this much. It's physiologically implausible. So the data that are collected are so poor quality that it doesn't really tell you anything. And so this then becomes a problem when people are like, here's a study that shows that people who eat red meat have increased risk of heart disease and increased risk of dementia, for instance. And there's some problems with the statistics as well, particularly when in some of those studies, what they do is they look at quintiles of, say, meat intake, like each 20%. So the bottom 20%, the middle 20%, and the top 20%. And what you do is you kind of look across quintiles, and so you basically compare the bottom 20% to the top 20%. And what you're usually doing is you're just looking at statistical outliers, and that's driving most of your results. So some of the statistics are tricky as well. But then people they just pick and choose. They're like, oh, this study says meat causes heart disease, and I don't like meat, so I'm going to tell you about this study where meat causes heart disease. And then when a study comes out that says, well, actually, meat is good for you. Meat reduces your risk of dementia. They're like, oh, epidemiology is terrible. Like, we can't trust these studies. So people just like pick and choose based on what they like. On the other side, you can do interventional studies, right? And so people get coaching or some kind of intervention to try and improve their diet. And this is usually better because ideally they're randomized as a control group. But these studies are much smaller and they're super expensive. It's really hard to do them. And so you can't do them for very long. And again, so you can kind of track like proxy measures, like how does their blood pressure change? How does their cholesterol change? How does their blood sugar change? Something like that. How does cognitive function change? They do that sometimes. But that still doesn't tell you about anything particularly long term. So you're and then sort of the best studies are like metabolic ward studies. And so Kevin Hall is like the king of the metabolic ward study. People have probably heard of his name. He's at the NIH. But you can only do that for like 2 weeks because basically what you've done is you've locked people in a room and you force them to eat exactly what you want them to eat. And then, like, depending on which study type you pick, there's always some big caveat, right? If you're locked in a room eating only what you're told to eat, that doesn't really translate to the real world. So, like, what questions are you trying to answer? And they do answer some important questions, but just the caveats are big. So there's just like a really long-winded way to answer your question to say nutrition research is really, really hard, and we don't have any really good ways of looking at the long-term effects of nutrition on health in a really rigorous manner. So we're kind of left sort of trying to piece all these different bits together to try and figure out how to navigate that.
How do you reconcile that then, Tommy? How do you put all those pieces together? And you're a practitioner, right? And I think it's all well and good when you are. And nothing yet, academics are very important, but it's very different when you've got a person sitting in front of you going, hey, Dr. Tommy, I need some help here. How do you reconcile that and then give them evidence-informed information and advice?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I kind of navigate towards. One is you have to start with what the individual is either interested in or capable of eating, right? Because if I tell you just to try a diet or completely overhaul the way you eat, and it's not gonna fit with your family, it's not the way you cook. If I tell you that you have to like home cook all your meals from Whole Foods and like you just don't have the time or the capacity, right? That's never going to happen. So first of all, having some understanding of like what's the framework that I'm working within, because I think there are multiple different frameworks where you can make this work. There's so many ways to skin this cat. So that's a starting point. Then I generally focus on like particularly if people are trying to eat for improved body composition and overall health. The easiest way to navigate that is to maximize nutrient density while minimizing calorie density, right? So that generally moves you towards whole, minimally processed foods, the nutrient dense meat, fish, eggs, dairy, fruits, vegetables, that kind of stuff. But you may have to sort of pick and choose depending on how the person's preferences look. And you certainly can bring in processed foods and supplements and that kind of stuff if you need to. And that's generally related to trying to hit some specific target. So is it a protein target, or is it a target for a specific nutrient? And the best way to figure that out is to test, do some basic blood tests, figure out where they are from a metabolic health standpoint, a nutrient standpoint. If they're amenable, you can do some meal or food diaries, have them take a photo of everything they eat or something like that, and you can kind of work with that and figure out what they're getting. And in that setting, that's a little bit more reliable than, say, some of the stuff I was talking about from the research world, because you're doing it on a much smaller scale. But that's kind of how I approach it. Figure out what the framework that they're working within is. Have some broad target in terms of how can we optimize nutrient density in a way that then supports calorie and macronutrient goals, and ideally have some idea of a starting point from a health standpoint: blood pressure, blood tests, body composition, if that's part of their goal, and then sort of that brings everything together.
Yeah. Amazing. Create the framework for the individual in front of you. There's something I've heard you say on other podcasts. I mean, I absolutely love it, but it's very interesting. And I think you've got a great seat at the table to answer this question. I heard you say that mice are not small humans. And I really liked it because I'm pretty sure right before I heard this, I saw someone on social media pull up this study talking about the benefits. I think it was like a fasting study or something in mice. And they said, oh, it's great. And I went, man, I'm not a mice. What are you talking about? Can you explain what you mean when you say mice are not small humans?
Yes. So I think one of the reasons why you say that I'm in a good position to talk about this, and I do think that I am to a certain extent, is that my day job is rodent studies, right? I do them for a living, and other sort of species relevant to the injuries that we're looking at, and so I have seen several times in my own research how something that works in a rat or a mouse does not work in humans. And that is the case more often than not. And I'll put my hand up and say, most studies that you read about mice will never be useful to you as a human. That is just something that we've had to accept as part of this scientific endeavor. There are a few different reasons for that. One is based on just basic metabolism. So fasting in a mouse is an incredible metabolic stress that drives all these sort of recovery processes, autophagy, all that kind of stuff. In humans, they're like, meh, it doesn't really do much because it's not a stress in the same way. Like if a mouse doesn't eat for 24 hours, it dies. And like humans, even if you're relatively lean, you can survive days, weeks, no problem. So it's just not having the same effect on the body. Then there are other aspects, like mice in general are herbivores. I mean, they are, maybe they can eat some sort of animal and other foods. They'll eat anything generally, but their gut is and their digestion and historically what they ate is not very similar to humans. So animals that are more similar to humans are other monogastric omnivores like bears and pigs. So if you're going to do a study on diet in an animal, those are much closer to humans than mice are. There's also things like, so I study brain injury, and the rodent brain is very little like the human brain. It's one of the reasons why we don't actually do that much rodent work anymore. One main example is, you ever seen a picture of a brain? It's kind of like gray, pink, and super wrinkly. A human brain, yeah. So those wrinkles, those are the folds of the cortex, and they're called gyri. That increases the surface area of the cortex, and that's part of the reason why we have such complex brains capable of very complex, cognitive processes. A rodent brain is completely smooth. It has no gyri whatsoever. And underneath that very smooth cortex is much less white matter. And white matter is responsible for like the really fast connections within the brain and between the brain and the body. There's like 10% white matter in a rodent brain compared to 60% white matter in a human brain. And a lot of the things that we're trying to study, traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's disease, preterm brain injury, that's something I study in the lab as well. These all have a big effect on the white matter. And yet you can't really study that in mice because they don't have very much. So there are all these different parts of mouse anatomy, physiology. There's the other part, which is that these mice are inbred. And they're bred to have a certain, response to a certain diet. So most studies in mice, most animal studies are done in mice, and most mouse studies are done in a mouse strain called the C57 Black 6. Which is specifically designed to get obese on a Western style diet. And so it's kind of like stacking the deck against this mouse, and then everything is done in this one very specific type of mouse. But if you do it in another type of mouse, it doesn't work. Nobody tells you that, but they just focus on this one type of mouse because that's where all the genetic tools and these other things are. So I believe strongly, it's my job, that animal research has a big role to play, developing new drugs, making sure they're safe, making sure they're doing what we think they're doing before we start translating them upwards. But I am also confident that most of what we do in mice does not translate to humans, and this is just a tug of war that we have, and we have to acknowledge that.
So, Tommy, if someone says to us, "Go and do your own research," don't just take my advice. Go do your own research, and say someone does start doing their own research and they start looking at this, how do they then sit back and go, okay, if we were to summarize the last 15 minutes and go, okay, what am I looking at to realize if this is good research or not?
Yeah, I think usually if you actually go and read the paper, which is difficult, and I don't necessarily expect that everybody has the experience and the ability to do that. Sometimes behind a paywall, sometimes it's full of jargon you just don't understand. But if you go and read the sort of the initial paper, whatever it is, could be a diet thing, fasting in a mouse, right? If you look at the discussion section, which kind of tries to put the results in context and all this kind of stuff, the authors are obviously biased. They want their work to be important, and we're all like that. Like, I'm no different. But they will have a big limitation section where they're like, we don't know if this works in humans, right? We know this works in mice. We don't know if it works in humans. But when the journalist turns it into a piece on, some website, they don't talk about that bit. So even, if you go and find the original paper, I think good scientists would say, here's where our results disagree with other results. Here's where our results disagree with what we see in humans. Here's why, we shouldn't suddenly jump to applying this to humans because we don't know how it translates across. And so that's one big part, is just acknowledging that there's a lot of limitations, and people do tend to do that. It's just lost when it's translated for the general public. And then the other part is thinking about how big was the study. If this was done in like 4 mice per group, and you can kind of see that from the graphs, that always like color me skeptical, or if it's only done in just like one very specific strain of mouse, but it's not been tried in other mice or other species or something like that, right? If something is going to work in humans, and there are actually criteria for this, again, they're not really adhered to, but so in certain brain injuries, there's something called the STARE criteria that was started for stroke studies. And they were like, if you think this is going to try and translate to humans, you've got to do it in multiple labs, repeat it multiple times, multiple animals, like multiple different ways of implementing it as well as assessing it. And so if all of those things line up, we can start to have confidence that it's going to be useful. But if somebody's like, hey, I've got this brand new finding in mice and it's never been done anywhere else, like, that's great. You're starting the journey, but you got a long way to go.
Excellent. Yeah, I can't see or think of too many posts I've seen on social media where the person starts with, hey, the limitations of this study. It's always the golden glitter. But Tommy, let's move on to a more sweeping nutrition, I don't want to say generalization, but principles, I guess. And I want to go through a few, that most people listening would have heard conflicting evidence about. And I
Okay.
think one of the most talked about one, and probably the most controversial we'll start with, is sugar. But where are we
Mhm.
at, Tommy? Where are we at with sugar? Is it good? Is it bad? Is there a time and place? Should we get rid of it altogether? What's the evidence say about sugar right now?
Yeah, I think this is interesting because I do think it's hard to extract sugar from all of the hyperpalatable, calorie dense, nutrient poor foods that we consume all day, every day. And sugar plays a big part of that. Um, but and there are some specific, right, if you go into like deep into the science of fructose, right, which is half, sugar is sucrose, which is half glucose, half fructose. You go into the science of fructose, and it does some kind of weird stuff in the liver. It behaves a little bit like alcohol in the brain. It kind of, if you give somebody pure fructose, it kind of switches off certain parts of the brain. It's different from glucose. But usually we're not consuming pure fructose, right? We're consuming it in the context of a hypercaloric, nutrient poor diet. And then there's issues, right? Fatty liver, because you don't have enough choline to export fat out of the liver when fructose is metabolized, and all these other things going on. So in general, I think a lot of people could focus on reducing their sugar intake, but in reality, when they do that, they're just decreasing their intake of hyperpalatable, nutrient poor, calorie dense foods. Right? I'm just going to say that again and again and again because I think that's where most of this leads. And there's some studies on ultra processed foods that are being done by Kevin Hall. Again, and I don't think these are published yet, but I've heard about sort of preliminary results. And again, what he's shown in terms of ultra processed foods driving overeating and all that kind of stuff, it all comes down to calorie density. It's got nothing to do with whether it's got a little bit of this gum in it or this flavoring in it or anything like that. Like, I think most of that is a bit of a red herring when the major issue is just overconsumption of calorie dense foods. So sugar plays a role there, but in the context of a nutrient rich, eucaloric or diet that otherwise supports all of your needs, I'm not particularly worried about a bit of sugar being in there.
Tommy, can you explain to the people listening when we say hyper palatable foods being part of a hypercaloric diet? Can you just break that down for us?
Yeah, so hyperpalatable essentially just means that, so palatable is something that's enjoyable to eat, and hyperpalatable foods are essentially this trifecta, usually of processed fats, processed carbohydrates, and some combination of salty and sweet in differing amounts. But if it's a Dorito, it's more salty, but there's a little bit of sugar in there. And if it's popcorn, then it's like sweet, but there's a little bit of salty in there. And that combination just makes us overeat. There are scientists who perfect this amount where like once you pop, you can't stop, right? You don't get palate fatigue, which is what you would normally get, right? If I sat you down with a bowl full of sugar and a spoon, like there's only so much of that you're going to eat. But right, I caramelize that and I put it on top of some popcorn and I add a little bit of salt, and all of a sudden it's magic. And so a colleague of mine, Josh Turknett, who's a neurologist, we host the podcast together. He talks about the different parts. He talks about the little different parts of popcorn, right? If you have dry popcorn on its own and sugar on its own and even like unsalted butter on its own, right? Eat either of those on their own, not very much, but together, I mean, it's just magic. Like it's really hard to stop. So that's what I mean by hyperpalatable. And then the other part is sort of hypercaloric or calorie dense. There have now been a lot of studies that look at and food texture plays a role as well. So something's like really crunchy and hard to eat, you eat less of it. It's really right. It's the difference between eating like dry crackers versus drinking a milkshake, right? Something's kind of smooth and slippery. Again, it would just keep it coming. And when you look at calorie density, there's this threshold where the brain doesn't seem to be able to regulate like volume versus calorie intake. And it's like, if you want to get technical, it's somewhere around 1.5 calories per gram. Above that point, there's so many, and this is on average, right, over an entire meal. So it's not that, so like a fatty steak has above that, right? But you have it with a salad, and overall, it gets below that threshold. And I don't want people to like get really nerded out and like start calculating calories per gram for their, like, if you please don't do that. That's not the goal here. But just saying that if you combine foods that are hyper palatable, right? We just want to keep eating them, that are kind of designed that way, with having a very high calorie density, and it's somewhere in that range. You get close to 2 or 3 calories per gram, then the body like can't figure out how many calories it's getting for the volume of food that's gone in, and you're more likely to eat more. So that's kind of that's what's happening there.
And Tommy, you're probably the perfect person to ask this. Is it doing something in your brain? Like you said, there's scientists who are literally dedicated to getting this trifecta of fatty, sweet, and salty all together. Is that giving you a different response in your brain than, say, like you said, when I grab the dry crackers out at grandma's and go, oh, yum, you're not getting the same response? Is that doing something different in your brain?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So um, again, there's a lot of debate. Are these foods addictive? Are they not? Right? There are specific criteria for addiction. I'm actually, I haven't picked a side on that because I'm not an expert in addiction, but it does seem to play some of these foods play a similar role or activate similar regions in the brain as become activated when people consume something or withdraw from something that they have a formal addiction to. So there's some overlap, certainly, but I'm not going to say that like buttered popcorn is addictive. I think it's much more complicated than that. But there is absolutely a difference in how the brain responds to these foods, because of course then that's how you have a continued drive to eat them.
Perfect. I think that's a great summary on sugar. So what we're going to say is that sugar alone, I don't think we want to just blame it all on sugar. There's probably some relationship here between these hyperpalatable foods being combined with a hypercaloric diet within this trifecta of the fatty, the sweet, and the salt. That's probably what's going to be causing us to overeat these types of foods, not necessarily just the sugar alone. Like you said, I've never seen someone just get a whole bowl of sugar and just go to town on that bad boy. It's always, like you said, in popcorn or it's cereal or it's something. Is that a fair summary, Tommy?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. And the sort of the final part of that that I haven't mentioned yet is the low nutrient density. And there are some nutrients that you may have a continued drive to eat in order to get enough of them. So the main is that we think we have the best evidence for is protein. So there's this idea as the protein leverage hypothesis that your body wants a certain amount of protein and it's going to keep eating until it gets that amount of protein. And all those foods we've talked about tend to be very low in protein. But it's also possible that some other nutrients may play a role there. So if you're only eating, cake, not many nutrients in cake. And so you're going to eat a lot of cake to get the protein and other nutrients that you need. So part of it may be that as well, that there's this drive to accumulate enough total nutrition. And when the food is nutrient poor, you have to eat more of it.
Perfect. Next topic I want to talk about, probably the most important thing we're going to talk about all today. And I've raged in debates about this because certain specific people in my team, don't drink coffee. They don't drink caffeine. They don't believe in it. And we rage wars about it, Tommy. We rage wars. We go to coffee meetings and he sits there and he just has his water. And I go, what are you doing? Tommy, where are we at with caffeine? I've heard both sides of the debate. I go, you know what? It's great for you. There's all these benefits. And then other people, they stand on their sword and they go, no, get rid of it. If you get rid of, there's so many benefits. Not where are we at with caffeine? Is it good for us? Is it not good for us?
Yes. So the again, it's nuanced, and I can understand both sides 100%. So first, if we think about the epidemiological data suggesting that caffeine, particularly coffee and tea, are associated with better health outcomes. 2 or 3 cups a day, maybe less heart disease, although There may be a genetic component there, depending on how fast you can metabolize caffeine. Maybe lower dementia risk, lower stroke risk, particularly neurological diseases seem to be lower in those who drink sort of like moderate amounts of coffee and tea. There was also a very recent study that came out that showed that timing matters, which I think also makes a lot of sense. So people who are drinking coffee early in the day have better benefits than people drinking later in the day. And that makes sense because if you're drinking later in the day, that caffeine is probably negatively affecting your sleep, or it's a marker of the fact that you had bad sleep the night before. And so that coffee isn't enough to overcome the effect of bad sleep. Most of that signal is probably due to, there may be some benefits to caffeine, and we test caffeine in the lab as a neuroprotective agent, and that's very interesting in some brain injuries, like good in some of the neonatal brain injuries we study, we think, but maybe not good in like a traumatic brain injury. So it's going to be different depending on the setting, but that's probably due to the antioxidant content of the caffeine and the tea. So the other things that are coming along for the ride, because when you look at the coffee data, decaf coffee seems to be just as good as caffeinated coffee. So it's probably the other stuff in coffee. And in the same context of a diet that's very nutrient poor, overall, when we think about how diet is affecting our health, we have to think of it in the general context of the diet in which the population we're studying. And so if we're studying this in the US, the UK, increasingly in Australia, is people who eat low quality foods and in general are not in great health, because the population on average isn't in great health. So that's the context. In that context, when you really struggle to get somebody to eat an apple, then the antioxidants in caffeine or in coffee are like the only time you get compounds like that, because you're just not getting them from the diet. So if you're, if the people on your team who don't drink coffee are eating, fruits and vegetables, berries, a great source of a number of polyphenols that have similar effects, they're probably getting those same benefits and they don't need to drink the coffee. In terms of the caffeine component, there are some data in some settings where caffeine is ergogenic. We know that's the case, particularly in endurance exercise, probably also in strength sports. But when it comes to cognitive function, it's much more complex. So caffeine definitely increases arousal, increases like performance on a reaction time or a psychomotor vigilance test. But when you then do a complex cognitive function test, something that requires significant executive function, like a go, no go, or working memory, like an NBAC test, actually caffeine doesn't make you perform better, and it may make you perform worse. Sometimes when we think we're performing better after consuming caffeine, what we've done actually is we've just overcome the deficit caused by a caffeine deficiency, because we're now dependent on caffeine, and we're not getting. It's sort of bringing us back to baseline rather than giving us extra benefits. And when we're trying to do complex tasks, a lot of these stimulants actually, they make us feel better, but they make us perform worse. So that's often the case with caffeine. And there have been other studies with other stimulants like methylphenidate and some of these stimulants that are used for like ADHD and similar things like that. You can maybe offset some of this with something like L-theanine. There are also alternative compounds that are increasingly interesting, like paraxanthine, which is a metabolite of caffeine that maybe doesn't have some of these sort of like overstimulating effects, which is probably what's causing the downsides on some aspects of cognitive function. So that's kind of like the full scope. Definitely not bad, but if somebody doesn't like coffee, I don't think, and they're getting their polyphenols from cocoa or blueberries or something like that, I don't think I can really force them to drink coffee because it's going to be good for them.
All I'm hearing, Tommy, is that I should probably stop giving him a bit of grief when we go to these coffee meetings and telling him he's embarrassing me by not getting a coffee and ordering water.
Well, you can cut this bit out if that's going to be a problem. That's fine.
I'll make sure he eats his fruit and veg before we go to the meetings. But Tommy, the next topic I want to go on to, very relevant, especially in the sports world, and you know this just as much as I do, especially in Australia, huge culture of drinking when it comes to sports. But even outside of sports, just everyday life. If you've got someone who's 9-to-5 worker in an office, very, very common after work drinks on a Friday. Everyone gets together, has a few drinks to wind down.
Mm.
Alcohol's gone through this whole evolution, especially in the last few years where we've maybe new research, but maybe even looked at the old research in a different light. What's your stance on alcohol right now? Is it still the 1 to 2 glasses of red wine is healthy and we see that has some benefits? Or are we at this point now where it's no alcohol is best? Or where are we at with that?
Yeah, I think it's probably somewhere like my best guess is somewhere between the two. When you look at um, like the historic studies looking at alcohol intake and various health outcomes, there was always this idea that somewhere around that kind of year, so like 1 or 2 glasses a day was associated with better health outcomes, and anything either side of that was associated with worse health outcomes. I think we now have started to appreciate that the teetotalers, people not drinking anything, who seem to have worse health outcomes, that's related to other. That's probably related to other things, right? You've quit drinking because you have a health problem or something like that. There's some signal of that, and then there's obviously that if you go further down, like the amount of alcohol, like 3, 4, 5 plus drinks a night on average, we know alcohol is a neurotoxin. It can affect multiple cells in the body, and in general, the more there's a good signal that more is worse. But so the idea is like, well, where's that kind of middle ground? I think there's some evidence that small amounts of alcohol may have this sort of like hormetic effect that drives some adaptations that improve resilience. But the signal of that is quite small. But again and again, almost every study you look at, there is this kind of maybe a slight signal that there's benefit at low levels. But what I really think it is just, there's no negative effect at small levels. That's really where I've ended up. And you could look at brain volumes. You can look at cardiovascular disease, cancer risk. As intake starts to increase, you sort of get these offset effects. So like maybe a few drinks might be protective against cardiovascular disease. It's a blood, alcohol is a blood thinner. We know that might decrease the risk of heart attacks, but risks of cancer go up. So they kind of like balance each other out, for want of a better word. And when you look at that kind of maybe 1 or 2 drinks a night on average, there really seems to be no major effect as far as I can tell. Or maybe there are pros and cons and they kind of like balance each other out. There's become this, but again, maybe even more so than just nutrition in general. Everybody wants the amount that they drink to be the right amount, right? And so and so, regardless of where you end up on this, people will argue with you. Um, Again, most of these studies are epidemiological, and the same with caffeine, the ones that I talked about, or coffee. The reason why I think I can be a little bit more confident in the data for coffee and alcohol is that people are much better at remembering how much they drink, right? Because it's one time of day and it's very consistent. I have this many cups of coffee and tea a day. People just know that. I have on average this much wine every night. So I think the data are better quality. And in reality, something like 1 or 2 drinks a couple of times a week, I don't really see any net negative effect. And then above that point, I think we start to see some potential harm. I'm, so I'm not encouraging people to go out and drink if they don't drink. I don't think there's any evidence to do that either. But I'm not sure that there's enough evidence to sort of get into this, frankly, quite puritanical approach that's been the case very recently, where people are like, all alcohol is terrible, you must drink none, or it's bad, or it's you're only going to get worse outcomes from there. And I'm not sure there's that much evidence to support that either. However, we know it impairs sleep. We know it can impair performance. So if you're focused on those things, alcohol is not going to help you. But kind of like you alluded to, if it's a social setting and it means that you're like out seeing friends, there's a huge benefit from that. If we're relying on it to de-stress from the day, I think that's potentially problematic. Like, you should think about, why do I have this habit? What am I trying to achieve with it? Is there a way that I can start to replace it? Like, why have I become dependent on this? I think that's worth thinking about. But it's sort of like these occasional drinks here or there, particularly in a social setting or for some other reason where there might be other benefits coming from that, I think that's fine.
Is there any evidence, Tommy, about your brain health with long-term drinking? And say if we're just saying 1 to 2 is okay, what about if they go above that and they're a bit more in the excessive realm, whether we say that's 3 to 4, 5 to 6? Is there any data on that and what that actually does to your brain?
Yeah, so there's a few studies that we could think about. One, there have been a few meta-analyses looking at alcohol intake and later risk of dementia. And it does seem to follow this kind of like U-shaped curve that I was talking about. The risk kind of decreases a little bit, somewhere around the equivalent of one small glass of wine a day. And like by that, I mean 125 mils of wine. It's not very much. And in the meta-analysis that I'm thinking of, like there was like a significant benefit for women in that range, but like no benefit for men. Like there was like the average was down, but it wasn't significant. So if there is any benefit, it's a very small amount on average. It's kind of right around there. But my guess is it's probably no net effect. Not good or not bad. It just is. Then once you get to sort of 2, 3+ drinks a day, then risk starts to increase. And there's some related studies from the UK Biobank. So they have a huge database of people. They've done MRI scans to look at people's brains. Once you get above sort of 2 drinks a day on average, brain volumes start to decrease. So we know that alcohol is a neurotoxin, and once you're regularly drinking that much, and that's kind of right on the cusp of what the maximum government guidelines are. Once you're kind of in that range and above, you do seem to see an increased risk of dementia, and you can kind of pick that up by doing a brain scan and seeing, right, this person has a smaller brain associated with that amount of alcohol intake.
Perfect. All right, Tommy, if we go on to the next one, I think that's a good little segue too. If we're talking about more in the longevity realm, and I know this is something you do a lot of good work in, what's the relationship between muscle mass and longevity, especially if we talk about strength as well in that mix, because we hear that spoken about quite a lot, but what's the relationship there with that?
This is one of my favorite things to talk about, obviously, because I like to lift weights. So
Very heavy
in
weights
general,
too,
I
by the way.
like to go around and tell people that they should be as jacked as possible. But this has also been very complicated and something, even in the research that we've done, because there's 2 different parts of this, right? One is, when we think about lifting weights, building muscle, like we think about like super jacked, super ripped people who are spending all day in the gym, but we don't really have any good data on that and long-term health outcomes in people, right? Because when you do these studies, generally they're big population studies, and most people in the population don't do that. So if I'm looking at a big population data set and I say, how do people like me, what does their health look like long term, if we're talking about training or body composition or anything like that, I couldn't tell you. I genuinely have no idea, because there aren't people like that in those data sets. So I just kind of have to like guesstimate and be like, oh yeah, I don't think my gym habit is bad for my health, because of, I follow and track other things, and I think that's fine. But we just have to acknowledge that. When we're talking about muscle mass in the general population, things are quite different. And initially there was this signal that people who had a low BMI, so usually kind of normal weight to low BMI, so sort of low 20s or high teens in terms of BMI, had a higher risk of death, and people who were sort of like overweight or had a BMI around 30 or so, sort of obese, had a lower risk of death. And then death risk started to increase again as BMI increased further. This was known as the obesity paradox. What people then found was that this is entirely related to how much muscle mass those people had. So it's actually, we know that BMI is actually a very bad predictor of health. And in general, if you looked at whether people had adequate muscle mass for a given BMI, then the mortality risk at the low end disappeared, and the people who had high risk were just those who just didn't have very much muscle mass. And we know that muscle mass is an endocrine organ. It releases a whole bunch of things that go around the body and improve health and function. It's our best glucose sink. So if we're thinking about metabolic health, blood sugar regulation, the more muscle you have and the more you move it, essentially the better you are at controlling your blood sugar. And that's a critical component of any chronic disease you care to think about. But the sort of the last part of this is quite nuanced because there have been some studies that, and particularly in men, but it's partly relevant to women as well, that show that very high muscle mass is associated with worse health outcomes. And then somebody like me is like, oh, this completely disagrees with my worldview. Like, how could I explain this away? And it's because when people have and I've seen supposedly smart people then go on social media and be like, you shouldn't lift weights because hey, it looks like having high muscle mass is associated with poor health outcomes. Like, I kid you not, people go out and say that based on these studies. When you then actually look at these data, you realize that people build muscle mass in two ways. One, by going to the gym and doing bicep curls and deadlifts, and the other is by just being bigger in general. If you have consumed more calories than you require, you will gain mass, and some of that mass will be muscle. But in that state, that's not the same muscle, and it's not the same function as a muscle that was gained through resistance training or some kind of physical activity. And so in those studies, those same studies, they show, yes, in those with very high muscle mass, they might have worse health outcomes. But the people who are stronger have better health outcomes, and there's no upper limit. Like, it's not like you get to a certain point where you've gained so much strength that it's bad for you. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. So the discrepancy is people who've built a lot of mass just by being, built a lot of muscle mass just by being bigger in general, but that muscle mass is not functional. They're not doing anything with it. And that's associated with worse health outcomes. So when we've done these kinds of studies looking at how does body composition relate to cognitive function in particular, we've looked at something called relative strength to try and even this out. Like, how strong are you for your body size? And then you see a very strong signal. So it's not about necessarily being a certain body composition or being a certain body size. It's being strong for the body size that you are. That's then associated with better health outcomes.
So, Tommy, you saying that the old myth of the dirty bulk versus the clean bulk, that's true? We don't want to be doing the dirty bulk?
Essentially, I think some of that is true. Yes. The difference being, though, that when the population are doing the dirty bulk, they're just doing the bulking and they're not actually lifting any weights. So the weights may help protect you in the setting of the dirty bulk. And let's just assume that everybody's natural, and not taking any extra supplements in this situation, because that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
I was going to say there's a whole bunch of 19 to 23-year-olds who are just shaking their heads listening to this, who are mid dirty bulk, eating their burritos, going, what are you talking about, Tommy? Tommy, last question before we move on from the muscle mass. Is there a set amount of exercise that we can recommend? Let's just say maybe we don't want to be the most jacked human on planet Earth, but we don't want to be small and we want to have this extra. We want to land in that middle. What's a good amount then that people should be aiming for?
Yeah, when we've looked at this, and I think this is fairly consistent with some other studies, probably the best way to estimate is using FFMI, so the fat-free mass index. That is essentially a BMI, but after you've taken away body fat. So if you know how much you weigh, you know your approximate body fat level, and you can, even like bioimpedance, DEXA, skin fold, even like a photo at this point. There are some apps now that will kind of give you a guesstimate that's probably good enough. Take away percent body fat from your weight, then divide it by your height. That's in kilos divided by your height in meters squared. That gives you your FFMI. It seems like for women, the best health outcomes are when FFMI is above 14 and ideally closer to sort of like 15, 16, 17. And then for men, it's above 17, 18, maybe closer to 20, something like that. And that's not huge. We're now talking like in the top sort of 50 to 30% of the population. So, doesn't require, a massive effort in the gym. And, you can think about what's sort of the minimum effective dose of resistance training to gain a reasonable amount of muscle and strength. I think they've I think it was Brad Schoenfeld's group like summarized these data a few years ago in a nice review paper, and they said like the minimum effective dose is like 4 sets per body part per week, 6 to 15 reps, and And if you need to save more time, do some like cluster sets or supersets or something like that. It's not that much. It's maybe one or two gym sessions a week, 2 or 3 sets per body part in each session. Obviously, getting close to voluntary like muscular failure, somewhere in that range, I think that's more than enough for most people.
Okay, so Tommy was saying 2 to 3 sets per body part per week, and you could probably get that done 1 to 2 days per week.
Yeah. So, well, four total sets, but you could do 2 or 3 sets times 2 sessions, or if you only have time for one session, you could probably get it done in one session.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Last question I want to ask you here, Tommy, before we move specifically into brain health. And I know a lot of people say, N=1, it's not great. And don't get me wrong, but I feel like when you've got someone like yourself who's got this world of knowledge, and I think that's something that you don't talk about a lot, and it doesn't get covered enough. You're an athlete yourself, you do strongman, and we're talking about muscle mass and being very jacked. That's you, right? You live and breathe this stuff and you do it. So you've taken all of this knowledge and you've applied it to your own life. The last question I want to ask is, how have you reconciled all this, and how has that led your own dietary intake? How has that led your own nutrition? What principles do you follow? And then how do you use that to navigate both your health and then your performance in strongman and those other competitions you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. The all the principles that we talked about are essentially what I try to apply, and I appreciate that I try and do it in a practical manner. Not everything I eat is like cooked from scratch at home from Whole Foods. Like, I'm busy like everybody else. But maybe two out of 3 meals are home cooked because I'll cook most nights, and then I'll have like leftovers for lunch, and I do the cooking every day. So then the main thing that I do is I focus on protein intake initially. So that's kind of where I start, and then I build on that, and it's usually sort of vegetable dense alongside that with some form of carbohydrate, and like any potatoes, rice, pasta, any of that. When I'm not cooking food from scratch, and so say I have like pre-prepared foods, I'll usually focus on stuff that has a very high protein content. So particularly if I'm eating processed foods, which I do, there are some protein cereals that I might have for breakfast, protein bars that have a high protein content, plus like fruit or some other like lean meat or something for snacks. That's kind of how I do most things. Do you have any questions about any of that? Do you need more detail, or does that kind of make sense? Anything that I haven't like explained enough?
No, that's great. But I think, Tommy, could you give us like an example, Dave? And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think we talk about this a lot, and we talk about all these principles. And I'll bring it back to say the social media, because a lot of our audience see this on social media. And I even look at it and I go, man, no one eats like that. No one eats perfectly clean 100% of the time. I've worked with some of the very best athletes on planet Earth, as have you. None of them eat like that. I've worked with top CEOs. I've worked with tech guys worth billions of dollars. None of them eat like that. And I think it's an important point when you have all this information, because that's what people are looking for. They're looking for information. Yeah. How do I best eat it? But then you have someone like yourself who knows all the knowledge, and then you put it to practice. And then it's like, well, Tommy's eating processed food. He's doing this. He's somehow finding a way to be very healthy. If you don't mind, Tom, can you give us like a rundown? If you're training, what are you eating in like a normal day? Say when you wake up, maybe do your training or whenever, what's breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks look like for you?
Sure. So I can just tell you what I ate yesterday, because it is pretty typical.
This is after we just spoke about how incorrect food recall is. So I apologize.
Exactly. When they call me up and they say, "How did you eat yesterday?" and I forget to tell them about my 7 beers. So I usually wake up around 6, and I have a cup of coffee. I think yesterday I had 2 cups of coffee, and my first meal usually around 8 or 9. Recently, my first meal has been protein cereal. Truly is a Canadian brand that has a really good sort of protein to calorie ratio, and it tastes like regular cereal. And it's not, as these kinds of foods go, I think like the ingredients are pretty good, and it tastes pretty good, and it's quick. So I can get like a high protein meal in, tastes good, That's how I start my days currently. Then in the morning, I usually eat like a few pieces of fruit, maybe a couple of apples, an orange, something like that. I think I had that yesterday, maybe two apples and an orange. Lunch was like a bunch of leftover salmon that we had. I think, and there was some leftover asparagus as well. So that was my lunch. Then I think I wasn't really hungry then, so I didn't eat anything before the gym. Oh no, I did have a protein bar before the gym. I had a David protein bar. I like those because again, they have a very high protein content. Then the gym yesterday was deadlift day, so did some deadlifts. Then sauna, cold plunge, and then dinner was a poke bowl that we ordered it. So like Tuesday nights, my wife and I we get poke, which is if people haven't had that before, it's like rice and raw fish, like sushi and veggies and that kind of stuff. And then I think I might have had a cookie. I think
Perfect.
that was it.
So what I'm hearing here, Tommy, mostly whole foods, very protein focused, but
Mhm.
just fueling and listening to your body cues. That's essentially
Yeah,
the Tommy Wood program.
that's it.
Man, that's
And then I because you did ask about training, so some of it will come down to if I've got a competition, it will come down to whether I need to make weight or not. So um, last May, I had my like first proper um, like weight class strongman competition. I had to get under 90 kilos. So that's like a 8 or 9 kilo drop. So I decreased calories slowly to sort of get me into mid to low 90s, and I did a water cut to come in. The rest of the time, because I can now, so like this year I'll compete again, but I'll compete as a master because I turned 40 in September. And then the weight class is it's not 90 kilos, it's 105 kilos. So I can basically eat wherever I want. Um, and I get stronger if I eat more. If I'm bigger and I'm in a calorie surplus and I gain a little weight of all types, I'm definitely stronger. So if I do that getting into a competition, then after that I'll usually cut back again, just sort of like get back to where I'm sort of happy from a body composition standpoint.
yeah, perfect. No, that's great, Tommy. So let's move on. I know this is going for a while, but one last topic, a few more questions, is brain health. I think this is important. Like you said at the start, your brain kind of does everything, right? And you got one brain throughout your whole life,
Mhm.
and it's the control center. Something that I hear a lot and that I feel is never really clarified that well. When people say, "Hey, you want to eat and eat well to do this, and you want to exercise to do this," we often say to have a healthy brain. But
Mhm.
what a healthy brain is never really clarified. Can you clarify what is that? What is a healthy brain, Tommy?
Yeah, I get this question a lot actually, and I think it's because people like it's very difficult to define. If we think about heart health or something, there's blood tests or some other things you can do. For fitness, right, and strength, there are tests that we can do. But like, how do you know if your brain is healthy or not? And I do have an answer, but it is slightly vague. But I think that also then gives us a framework to work from because what I want my brain to do isn't necessarily the same thing as what you want your brain to do. So I would say, and this is kind of stealing some definitions of brain health and mental health from like the World Health Organization. They have some quite nice definitions of these things. Um, is that a healthy brain is a brain that allows you to do the thing that you want to do when you want to do it. And like that's it essentially. So if you want your brain to be really good at chess, right, then it's allowing your brain to do chess well at the time that you want to do chess well. But it could also be knitting or languages or skateboarding or statistical analysis for data sets like I have to do and so any of those things. And that then sort of gives you the starting point.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And then if we're saying so, healthy brain is the thing that allows you to do the thing when you want to do it. What are
Yeah.
the practices then that are key for your optimally functioning brain? Is it doing those things, or is there other things that you can do that help you to be able to do that?
Yes. And so you're right that the way I framed it kind of sets you up to give the answer that I want to give, which is something I don't think we appreciate enough, which is that if you want your brain to be good at something, you have to do that thing with your brain. And it sounds super obvious, um, but it's not something that we necessarily do enough of. So if you think about, I always relate it back to exercise because it's something that people understand, right? You want to get stronger, you need to go and lift heavy things in the gym, right? You want to be fitter, run faster, you have to go and do some base miles and then some hard repeats, some intervals, right? That's going to make you faster. And the brain is essentially the same. So if you want your brain to be good at focusing, you have to practice focus, no distractions, deep work, and being in the right state of mind. If you want to be good at decision making, you need to practice decision making. If you want to be good at driving, right? We're talking about Formula One drivers, you need to practice driving. And what I mean by practice, when we're actually building skills or abilities within the brain, it's driven by focused practice or exposure right at the edge of our current capabilities. So we spend all day reading emails, doing podcasts on Instagram. We're using our brains all day, but we're not challenging our brains. We feel busy, but that's not the same as really applying challenge. So challenge is what, intense periods of work, and we could probably only do maybe 20 or 30 minutes at a time, right at the edge of your current capabilities, with probably frequent failure, right? If you're not failing, you're probably not pushing hard enough. That's why I broke a bunch of ribs as a snowboarder, is because I kind of leaned into that idea too much. But that's what I mean by sort of how you drive function. And usually, as I've kind of suggested, as we get older, we just stop doing that. We stop challenging ourselves. We stop putting ourselves in a position to fail because we hate that feeling. We hate the feeling of failure, especially if you've got a bunch of people watching you or just being bad at something. So we just avoid it. But that's the good stuff. So first you have to think about, well, what do I want to be good at? Am I spending time focusing on doing that? And there's this idea of sort of transfer, right? So if you learn a musical instrument, or you learn a language, or you learn a complex motor skill, you also tend to see benefits in other related aspects of brain function. So it might improve. So kids who learn music have better executive function skills, like decision making skills. So it's not just that they're better musicians, it also translates to better brain function overall. Then on top of that sort of pillar of stimulus, there are two other areas that I talk about. So this fits into what I call the 3S model: stimulus, supply, and support. So stimulus is all that stuff that we were talking about. And other aspects like social interaction are really important in stimulus. Like how you engage with the world and with others is basically what falls into that bucket. Then in supply, right, if you challenge your brain, you need to have an adequate supply of blood flow, oxygen, some kind of metabolic fuel, and nutrients in order to respond to that. So if we go back to our muscle building analogy, we know that you need to get in the gym, you need to lift heavy weights, but you can get a better response to that if you eat adequate protein, adequate calories, right? So you can support that process by having an adequate supply of nutrients, and the brain is the same. So you need a healthy cardiovascular system to get blood flow and oxygen to the parts of the brain that are active. So that's where physical fitness becomes really important. Heart health becomes really important. You need good metabolic health, right? You need to get glucose and ketones or lactate or whatever it is that you're using to fuel your brain. It needs to be able to get in. And if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic or have metabolic disease, you have a greater chance of cognitive decline and dementia because you're not able to fuel the brain properly. And then you need the nutrients that we know sort of just form the basic components of the brain, and that's cell membranes, organelles, synapses, all that kind of stuff. So your really important ones include omega-3 fats, B vitamins, iron, vitamin D. All those things are critically important. And then the final part is what I call the support part, which is again, returning to our analogy of building muscle. We know that you don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you rest and recover afterwards, right? And so the brain is the same. So sleep is critical. That's when memory consolidation happens, skill consolidation happens, you know, metabolic waste gets cleared out, all that kind of stuff. And then you need to avoid things that kind of prevent that process from happening. So chronic stress is one, and then alcohol is another, smoking is another, those kinds of things that kind of prevent that adaptation process from happening. So those are kind of the big buckets. And then I use that framework to say, well, for a given individual, which bucket is maybe the one that's the most neglected? Or, you know, you could think of like, what have I done in each of those buckets today to kind of help my brain? Sort of like it's not like it's purposefully not this big laundry list of stuff that you need to do, because that becomes daunting and stressful in its own right. But it kind of gives you an idea to think, well, where's the lowest hanging fruit? Where's like the small thing I can do today to kind of make that picture fit together better?
So we've got the stimulus. You need the stimulus to get the brain going. Then you need to supply it with good nutrients, the blood flow, everything that needs to support the brain. And then the last part, support with the sleep, recover, avoid things that are going to hinder that process.
Exactly.
What are some of those nutrients? Let's focus on that, Tommy. You mentioned a couple there, omega-3s. What are some of these other nutrients and nutrition principles that support this whole process and this framework?
Yeah, so I think there are a ton of different ways that you can look at this, and we mentioned antioxidants earlier. There's some nice data on the importance of antioxidants for like the whole system of the brain functioning, like polyphenols that you get from coffee, cocoa, berries, that kind of stuff. And I think that's an important bit of it. But the real core things that we know the most about are probably those ones that I mentioned up front. So, and they all tend to synergize together. So I'll give you an example: B vitamins and omega-3 status, and specifically B vitamins that are important for methylation, so affect homocysteine levels. And homocysteine is kind of like it sits in the middle of the methylation cycle, and it's kind of like a marker of how your methylation is working. High homocysteine is associated with a significantly increased risk of dementia, but also a number of other neurological diseases like strokes and heart disease as well. And in studies where they've had people with high homocysteine and they've given them B vitamins to lower homocysteine, the result has been super variable. So much so that people are like, well, lowering homocysteine doesn't work. At the same time, there have been a ton of studies that have given omega-3 like fatty acids to try and prevent dementia. We know that like long chain omega-3s, so like EPA is really important for the health of the vascular system. We already talked about why that's important. And DHA is really important for like it sits in the membrane of the synapse, is important for mitochondrial function and for synapse function. And there are lots of studies where they give people omega-3s and they're like, it doesn't really work. And so then everybody's like, well, omega-3s don't work for dementia prevention. Now, what's interesting is that in at least 3 randomized controlled trials, and there may be more now, if you have high homocysteine, so low B vitamins, and good omega-3s, you see no effect. And the opposite is also true. If you have low homocysteine and good and low omega-3s, right? So not enough, so good B vitamins, but not enough omega-3s, you don't see any benefit. You have both, and you see significant benefit. So they synergize. You need both to see benefit. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because we have all these trials where we just change one thing and it doesn't work, and then everybody's like, oh, it doesn't work, because they haven't taken the context into consideration. So it makes sense why these would synergize, because if you're trying to get omega-3 fatty acids into the brain, first, they need to get into the brain, but then they need to be attached to a phospholipid to sit inside a membrane, and that requires methylation. So if that's not working, you can take as much omega-3 as you want, and it's not going to get where you want it to get. And then other nutrients become important in that, like choline, because choline is what forms part of the phospholipid, or is a precursor to what forms most phospholipids with DHA, which are usually phosphatidylserine or phosphatidylethanolamine, but you can turn choline into those, which requires methylation. So you need all the bits to come together to have an effect. And then some of the other things I mentioned, like iron, is really important. We know that anemia is associated with an increased risk of dementia. Vitamin D is really important for neurotransmission, and low vitamin D is and also important for like creating serotonin from its precursors. Vitamin D is critical for. So vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased risk of dementia. Those are the main ones. Magnesium status seems to be important for cognitive function. It helps to modulate neurotransmission as well, particularly glutamate, which is sort of the main excitatory neurotransmitter. And so there were a bunch of other things. We talked about antioxidants. So there's some evidence that glutathione status is really important. And when you talk about glutathione, then you're thinking about things like vitamin D and vitamin C as well, because they help to recycle glutathione. And so there's a bunch of stuff that's important. But those core ones, B vitamins, omega-3s, vitamin D, those are kind of the big ticket items, as well as making sure that you have good blood sugar control. So measuring HbA1c or fasting glucose or insulin or something like that. I know you didn't ask me about those, but those are kind of like the big ticket items if you're thinking about things to track nutrient or diet status as it relates to cognitive function and dementia risk.
I want to ask you, Tommy, and I didn't put this in the brief, but you did mention it before, your brain running on ketones or using glucose as an energy source. That's a question that pops up a lot as well. Is there one that's more preferable for your brain? Is there one that it prefers? Is there one that's better? Is there studies on that in the long term? Or what's your position on it?
Yeah, there aren't as many good studies as I'd like there to be. There's been a ton of talk about, say, ketones after brain injury. And I'm waiting for a good study to come on that. They've been like super promising for decades at this point, but the evidence hasn't come up yet. There are some initial studies in individuals with cognitive impairment and dementia where not necessarily going on a ketogenic diet, but supplementing with something that increases ketone production. And the best studies have used short chain MCTs, so like C8 MCT oil, which those medium chain triglycerides go straight to the liver, they get turned into ketones, and that seems to improve the metabolic state of the brain and improve cognitive function. So in sort of disordered metabolic states, ketones may be a good alternative fuel source if glucose isn't getting in. I think there's a ton more to be done there, but if somebody had significant cognitive impairment, I think there's enough evidence to say, hey, you could try it and see if there's any benefit. When you look at like how whether the brain prefers glucose or ketones, there are some cells in the brain that are like they have to use glucose, and then the rest can use ketones. But even if there are some cells in the brain that have to use glucose, you can make enough glucose through gluconeogenesis, like from glycerol from the breakdown of fatty acids or from protein in the diet. So there are people whose brains work just fine without eating any carbohydrates, and they make enough glucose from other sources, and then the rest is sort of ketone dependent. When you look at if you give the brain both, and this has usually been done in the developing brain. And there are some kind of sketchy studies that were done with like human fetuses back in the 70s or something that kind of looked at this. Studies that just wouldn't be able to be done anymore. But if you give the brain both, and there are some studies in rats that do the same thing. And for this specifically, rat brain metabolism seems to be quite similar to humans, just to kind of tag on to the stuff we were talking about earlier. If you give the brain both glucose and ketones, particularly the developing brain, and I think it'll be the same for the injured brain as well, the brain uses glucose for energy and it uses ketones as a synthetic precursor. So it uses it to synthesize cholesterol and fatty acids, which are really important for like the structure of the brain. So I think that's one of the reasons why ketones might be beneficial after like a concussion or traumatic brain injury, because ketones are what your brain uses to build brain structure. And so if you have to do some repairs, then ketones might in addition to being a fuel source, they might be beneficial there. Another thing in that context is lactate. So when you have a brain injury, it seems that the brain seems to be even more likely to take up lactate and use it as a fuel source. And lactate, so like George Brooks's work, which has been around for a long time, and he does fabulous work, but it's kind of like it's made us ready to see the study where we give lactate after a concussion or traumatic brain injury and see if it improves outcomes. And that study just hasn't been done yet, or it's being done right now. So these alternative fuel sources like ketones and lactate may be more accessible to the brain in sort of injured or deranged, like metabolically deranged states. There's more work to be done there, but people go around and they say, oh, well, you have to eat carbs because your brain needs carbs. That's not true. There are also people who say, the brain is supposed to run on ketones, so you shouldn't eat too many carbs. That's not true either. Our brains seem to be really good they're quite metabolically flexible, just dealing with what's available to them. And if you're healthy and you're metabolically healthy, I think the fuel source matters much less. Then it's when you're in injured or metabolically deranged states, or there's like a neurodegenerative state, then I think these alternative fuels are very promising, but we just have to acknowledge that there's more work to be done there.
So if we're talking about that healthy person, Tommy, how would you reconcile all of those recommendations for what they actually do day to day? Because if we're saying, hey, you need the omega-3s, the antioxidants, the polyphenols are good, but then we need things like B vitamins, vitamin D, you need both glucose and the fats. What are you then saying to that person? Are they just grabbing bucket loads of ketone IQ, putting that in, and then they're having omega-3 supplements, they're doing all this? Or is it, can they get this in food? Is that even possible? Or what do you recommend?
Yes. So I would just get it from food, right? If we like all the things we talked about, you have a few blueberries or a couple of cups of coffee, and then you occasionally eat some fish and some eggs, and like they have a good B vitamin content. If you really want to go for a B vitamin powerhouse, once a week have a bit of liver. That's it, right? Job done. It's not. I'm not talking huge amounts of really difficult to get nutrients. If you're eating nutritious food, you're going to get all this stuff. And then maybe you need to tinker with it a little bit depending on levels of certain things or certain requirements. But this really these levels and intakes really aren't hard to hit as long as you're eating actual food.
Yeah, so the diet, pretty much what we were saying before, and what the diet that you follow, right, is like mostly whole food. Process when it's necessary. Make sure you're getting nutrient dense foods and not getting too much calorically dense foods, and you should have this covered.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we've got that diet part, then last question I want to ask you on the brain then, Tommy. I've heard you talk about this task. Funny enough, I've been learning French, and I go to my French lesson at the end of the day on a Monday, and my French I think she's pretty rough, to be honest, because I leave that, the way we go through this lesson, I leave it, and I've done combat sports for over a decade. I run ultra marathons. I've trained since an athlete since I was 5 or 6. But I'm never more tired than when I leave this French lesson. And I go, I feel so fatigued. Not only do I feel really dumb and not good at this, but I feel so fatigued. But I've heard you talk about there's this relationship between failing at a task and how that's beneficial for your neuroplasticity in the brain. Can you explain that?
Yeah. This is funny. And so like you're exactly putting yourself in that scenario that we talked about earlier, right? And this kind of focus that it requires to learn a new language in this setting, and not be very good at it occasionally, it's hard work, and you can feel that. When you think about failure specifically during learning, it's interesting. There's like whole branches of like cognitive neuroscience or psychology that look at like the benefits of failure for learning, and it's really interesting because even when students benefit from failure, which they do, we have an education system that discourages failure, right? You have to be the best all the time. And if you fail, then you're not good, right? So even though we know that failure is good, we discourage it. And students also think that failing is bad for them, even though, and there are studies where students say that failing is bad for them, even in a setting where failing has made them better. So we kind of have this idea that failure is bad, when in fact the brain is constantly on the lookout for things like failure. And what I mean is your brain is essentially a prediction machine, right? All of your experience is essentially a prediction of what your brain thinks is going to happen, because you're actually experiencing it after it's happened, right? Like everything's on a delay. So most of your experience is the result of a prediction. And the brain notices when there's a difference between what it predicts is going to happen and what actually happens. And that the size of that error, if we notice it and we do something about it, drives the learning process. So when I think that I'm going to stick some massive snowboard jump and I'm going to look super smooth doing it, right? And what I actually do is wipe out and tumble and break a few ribs, right? My brain is like, oh, there's a big gap between what I thought was going to happen and what actually happened, right? And if you and then it starts to compare them and say, well, what was the difference? What happened there? And then that, it increases noradrenaline in the brain, starts to increase acetylcholine, right? It increases arousal. It's stressful. But those are the things that then start to drive change in neuroplasticity. So it's this difference between reality and expectation that the brain is constantly on the lookout for, and we can measure it with, there are certain electrical patterns in the brain where the brain's like, oh, hey, that's not what I thought was going to happen. And then that's kind of what starts to drive change. So you can do this in a much safer environment, which is when you think this word in French, and then you say it, and you realize, oh no, that's not what I meant. Right? That's the failure that's going to slowly move you closer to actually being able to do the thing that you want to do.
It's funny you say that, Tommy, because I went to Quebec over the holiday period, and I thought, you know what, time to shine. I've done about 6 weeks of lessons here, and I'm like, and I went to the grocery store, and Tommy, I not that I choked, I went, I'm doing it, and God, it was disastrous, and just the look of disgust from this Quebecois, and then she switched to English, and I went, oh God, I got a bit of work I got to get through.
But you did it. But that's the thing, right? Is you're like, well, maybe you thought it was good. Maybe you thought it was going to be better than it actually was. But even if you knew it was going to be kind of rough, you kind of like you leaned into it, and that's the right approach. And I don't think that's what we do enough of, because we don't want to be the person where like you get in the squint and be like, no, let's just switch to the English because we can't understand what this guy's saying.
Thought she was going to just start and ask me how I was. Hi, how are you? But straight out the gate, she asked me if I wanted bags, and God, it threw me, Tommy. It threw me. So, Tommy, if we're going to summarize not just the brain health component of this, or what we spoke about with the diet and with the brain health, if you were to summarize this and say an elevator pitch, or what you recommend the people listening, you want to be the healthiest you and you want to have the healthiest noggin on your shoulders, what are your top tips for them to do?
I think the most important thing because like without like going back over all the stuff that we said, I think most of the things we talked about, right? Ignoring and now I'm not getting into the elevator pitch yet, but I'm setting myself up for the pitch. Ignoring the fact that there are dietary wars and all these other things. I think we know that we could eat a little better, we could sleep a little more, we could do a little bit more physical activity, right? So assuming that we know that stuff already, the most critical thing, if you're thinking about your long-term brain health, is how you use your brain and interact with the environment around you. Like, go out and do things with your brain with other people, and have it be hard occasionally and fun, right? It can absolutely be fun and should be fun. But what happens in general as we get older is we do less and less of that. And as a result, our brain function declines because our brain's like, hey, I'm not really needed around here. So I'm metabolically expensive. I'm, may as well just waste away because I don't really have any raison d'etre for your French. And so the way that we drive ongoing function of the brain is we go out into the world, interact with people, do difficult things, learn new things. And by doing that, right, that's our bicep curls in the gym, that's our sprints on the treadmill, right? That's how we continue to drive function. So there's a huge sort of body of research out there that says that each of us has this wide potential for cognitive function, right? Mine isn't the same as yours, but within mine, it could be much higher or it could be much lower, depending on how I choose to use my brain. And the vast majority of that is dictated by the environment that I put my brain in and how I use my brain. So as part of that, people should know that they have a huge amount of control. It's not that your cognitive function is fixed and it's just going to get worse over time, which is what most people think. It's just like knowing that you have a huge amount of control, and actually it's quite fun, or can be quite fun, to change that. Go skateboarding, go learn some French. Doesn't have to be daunting, can be fun. You have a huge amount of control over it. That's the elevator pitch. Hopefully we'll go up like 50 stories so I could get that whole thing in.
It's important. We'll keep them in for the 50 stories because the people need to hear it. But the last two questions I ask everyone who come on the podcast, Tommy, and I always preface it with this little story. I have a very good friend that I run with, and he's a fighter jet pilot. And he hit me with this first question, and I thought, man, I've worked in high performance over a decade, and I was like, why do I not just have a straight out answer for this? And it was quite interesting when I sat down and thought about it. So I'm very interested to hear what your answer is. And I guess this is in more of a general sense before I more specifically ask you in your life. But in a general sense, how do you define performance?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I would always defer back to that similar, like, it's kind of like, how do you define brain health? Is performance is being able to do the thing that you want to do at the time you want to do it, right? And obviously that requires some realistic expectations. I'm never going to stick that snowboard jump because I'm just not that good a snowboarder. So within the parameters of your common sense, that's what it is. It's being able to do the thing that you want to do at the time that you want to do it.
Great answer. Now, Tommy, for you in your life, you do heaps of crazy things, not just with your work, but with your personal life and with sport. What is performance for you in your life right now?
Yeah, right now, performance is like being able to find the time to write the book that I'm trying to write. That's probably the main thing. But in reality, it's those same things broadly. It's being able to wake up excited to do the things that I have to do that day, and then be able to sort of relax and sort of de-stress after that, and spend time with my family when we're able to. That's as much it is as it is really. I don't compete in strongman to go and beat anybody else. I just go because it's fun. It gives me something to work towards. So yeah, I think my answer is the same. Like being able to do the things that I want to do at the time I want to do them.
Amazing answer, Tommy. Now, there's lots of people going to be listening to this and go, man, I need to follow Tommy. I need to see his work. I need to potentially get in contact with him. Are there socials they can follow you on? Is there an email or website? Give us a drop. Everything, if people want to know everything Tommy Wood, how do they get around it?
So I usually post most stuff on Instagram. So usually when there's podcasts or when we've written papers that we think people will be interested in, those go on Instagram. So that's at Dr. Tommy Wood. I have a podcast, like I mentioned, the Better Brain Fitness podcast with my friend and colleague Josh Turknet, who's a neurologist, and we together have a Substack, which is betterbrain.fitness. If you'd like, you just put that in the URL, it will take you to our Substack. The Substack's free. When you sign up, you get this long PDF on nutrition and blood markers for like cognitive function and dementia prevention, or at least I can't promise dementia prevention. Decreasing dementia risk is the more scientific way to say it. And yeah, we also have there's like a paid version. So like, everything's free, but there is a paid version where we also do like a monthly AMA call if people are interested in that. So any of those places is go there.
Well, so much good info. I know you're a very busy man, so Dr. Tommy Wood, thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thanks so much for having me. This is honestly, I do a lot of podcasts, and this was a lot of fun.
Tommy, I'll chat to you soon.
Yeah, cheers.